Uh, Welcome to this event hosted by the Sydney Morning Herald and the United States Studies Centre. I'm Matthew Knott. I write about foreign affairs and national security for the Herald and the Age. I was previously the US correspondent for the papers during the 2020 election and have been watching things from afar from here. I spent the past few weeks on the election trail with Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton. So this is a much more refined, civilized, cerebral environment and a happy place to be. So thank you all for coming out on a drizzly Sydney evening. So we're talking about 100 days of the Trump administration. It probably feels a lot longer. We can't say we aren't living in interesting and historic times. Since Donald Trump returned to office, we've seen the president impose tariffs and swiftly remove them and possibly impose them again. We've seen share markets plummet and soar. We've seen Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency tear through the United States bureaucracy. We've seen legally questionable and indeed quite possibly illegal deportations of foreign citizens who have not necessarily committed any crimes. We've seen Trump berate Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office, then meet with him just a few days ago on the sidelines of Pope Francis's funeral in the Vatican. We've seen him rattle American allies in Europe, stir a nationalist backlash in Canada with big consequences there, and start a still pretty tentative conversation here in Australia about whether we need a more independent foreign policy. All that's happened in just 100 days. The Atlantic this week published a lengthy cover story on Trump's return to office, which I highly recommend. When the authors asked Trump whether his second term felt different from his first, he said it did. He said, "The first time I had two things to do, run the country and survive. The second time I run the country and the world." Like so much of what Trump says, it's overblown, but it's also getting at something true in a way. His second administration undoubtedly feels more consequential for the world and more consequential for policy in the United States than the first time around. So it's great to be here with an esteemed panel to talk about what they've made of this first 100 days and where we're going from here. To be seated next to me when he arrives very imminently will be Peter Hartcher, the political and international editor for the Sydney Morning Herald. Then we have Mike Green, who is the chief executive of the United States Studies Centre. He served as a senior official and specialist in Asia policy in the George W. Bush administration and is also an expert in Japanese politics and the Indo-Pacific more generally. Jared Mondschein is Director of Research at the United States Studies Centre, and if you want to know something about the US, he'd be one of the first people I'd call up to find out. And we also have Catherine Naylor, who is the world editor for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. In her current job, she oversees our foreign coverage, which includes wrangling our correspondents around the world across various time zones. So it would be good to discuss, and then we'll also have a good amount of time for questions at the end. So if you want to start thinking of a question you'd like to hurl at one of our panelists, go for it. And first, I think we have a video to show from our US correspondent, Michael Koziol, who's been there living the drama of the first 100 days.
The biggest question that I seem to get from people back home at the moment is, what's it like living in Trump's America? And I think from talking to people, for most Americans, not much has really changed since before Trump took over. Of course, there are a lot of people here in this city, in Washington, federal workers who, perhaps either have already lost their jobs or live in fear of it. So for those people, yes, life is different. If you're an undocumented migrant, for example, or you know people, you have friends and family who are undocumented, then obviously your life looks different as well.
And on day one, I will launch the largest deportation program of criminals in American history. We're going to get them out.
And obviously, if you're a teacher, or increasingly if you're a university academic at an Ivy League university, for example, your life might look different. But for many, many Americans, things, go on as they were. Their attention is on their grocery bills, which have not gone down and continue to go up, despite what President Trump claims. In Kentucky, I met the head of the American Soybean Association. He's a 9th generation farmer named Caleb Ragland, and he doesn't really know at this stage whether there's going to be a market for those soybeans from the largest purchaser of American soybeans, and that's China. At the moment, there's 125, 145% tariffs in each direction between the world's two largest economies, and that effectively amounts to a trade embargo.
We are very concerned about the implications due to the fact that 50% of U.S. soybeans are exported. China bought more soybeans from us than all other exporter markets together, so we're very concerned about losing another big chunk of our largest export market.
It's certainly true that the shine has come off Donald Trump. Most of the polls show his approval rating has come down quite a few points since January. That is mostly based off people thinking that he's not handling the economy as well as he could be, that he's not devoting as much attention to the economy that he could be. And obviously, there are a lot of market jitters about tariffs.
We're going to tariff the hell out of them.
And we've seen in recent days and weeks attempts to kind of mollify the markets by backing off on a lot of those tariffs or saying that they will come down. But people are still nervous, and they're seeing that their bills are not going down, although, as Trump points out, the price of oil has come down since he took office, so that's giving people some relief. Trump has lost a lot of favour with two groups where he really was able to make inroads during the campaign, and those were Hispanic voters and young voters under 30. These are two groups that obviously the Democrats long had a stranglehold over, but Trump was really able to run up the vote in those demographics. However, since the election, he's really lost a lot of his sheen with those two groups. Nonetheless, when you talk to people that voted for Trump, they're not having buyer's regret. They're saying he needs more time, that he seems to be doing the right things, that he's taking strong action. That's one of the things that they mainly wanted to see. There was a real sense that Joe Biden was a weak leader. People were crying out for what they saw as strong leadership. And Donald Trump, whether you agree or not with a lot of the things that he says and does, is someone who at least looks like being a strong leader. Having said all that, not everyone in America is in love with Donald Trump. Since he took office, there have been protest movements galore across the US, directed not just at Donald Trump, but also at Elon Musk.
A star is born, Elon.
And his perceived takeover of the bureaucracy and the cuts that he and his Doge team have been making in the name of government efficiency.
This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy. Chainsaw!
I think the final important thing to say is that during his first 100 days, Donald Trump has picked a lot of fights. So he's obviously picked a fight with the world on trade and tariffs. He's picked a particular fight with Europe over Ukraine.
You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
And he's picked a fight with the courts here in the US, particularly over immigration, which is obviously an issue where the Republicans think they're on a winner with the public.
Mike, to start with you, I might pick up on some of the points that Michael was getting at there. You've been back to Washington since Trump came back to office. I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what the mood was in the Capitol and perhaps how it differed to the first time. One thing that I feel from afar has been striking is the last time we saw the rise very quickly of the resistance, it was called, with capital R, huge protests, women particularly activated, and that from afar it seemed different this time. It seemed like there was a more muted response. But what did you find when you went to DC?
So I'm from D.C., and I was home, and I was, talking to members of Congress, officials in the White House, think tank leaders, and others. And the general mood, I was there 3.5, 4 weeks ago, was I describe it as despondent. The Elon Musk Doge operation got access to the Treasury Department's payment system so that Elon Musk's people were hitting the stop button on payments with no assessment of what it meant. So about 4% of the federal workforce got fired. NGOs got shut down. A couple of federally funded think tanks were shut down and people escorted to the door. So it was a pretty dark mood. And it wasn't just in the U.S. Agency for International Development or NGO world, it was in the Pentagon and the CIA and Republican staffers in the Congress. I think now the mood's a bit different, honestly. At 100 days, all the major media organizations did polls of what Americans think of Donald Trump's performance. He won in November on 3 issues, basically. Inflation, immigration, because the illegal immigration problem in the U.S. was pretty bad, and decisiveness. People, saw Joe Biden as old and flailing, and the world seemed to be going in the wrong direction. And he had, 5 to 10, some polls 15-point advantages over Biden and Harris, and positive ratings in all those. Even though a majority of Americans said they didn't personally like him that much, they thought he was the guy who was going to solve these problems. So he came in and did this shock and awe. In American football, it's called flooding the zone, if any of you are American football fans. So you send all your players to one part of the field, the quarterback throws the ball, the defense is overwhelmed.
There's a version of that with some profane language at the end about flooding the zone.
Yeah, footy or, but and it works like once or twice. You can't play the whole game with that strategy. So his first 100 days has been shock and awe, flood the zone, everything, everywhere, all at once. Everyone was on their back foot. Everyone was sort of shocked and stunned. Republicans in the House and the Senate were afraid to say anything. And then the polls came out, and his tariffs cause inflation and are deeply unpopular. About 65% of Americans in the polls say they don't like his economic policy, they don't like the tariffs. 85% of Americans think he's treating Canada badly. His decisiveness has backfired because 2/3 of Americans in polls say he's going too far against the courts and against universities. Immigration should have been the issue because he actually did bring down illegal immigration where he got positive ratings, but even there, he's underwater. There's a net 55% negative view of what he's done because of all the stories of these illegal or unethical deportations. And he has the lowest polling of any president in his first 100 days since polls have been taken 80 years ago of presidents in their first 100 days. The second worst is him, last time. So the mood now, you're starting to see universities are banding together, court cases are going against him, and I think, and I'll just end with this, but I think that basically the coming months are going to get harder for him, not easier. The tariff impact is really going to start hitting in a month or two when Americans realize that when they go to the pharmacy, antibiotics cost 3 times as much and things like that. And then he has not gotten anything done in Congress, but he has to get some legislation through for his budget. And right now, the way things are going, he can't get it passed. So we might be at peak Trump. That doesn't mean he'll change. It doesn't mean the unpredictability and the pugnaciousness will stop. But I think kind of the system is fighting back a bit.
Peter Hartcher wanted to come into a round of cheery applause. So, Mike, while Peter takes a seat, I guess devil's advocate on that, if Trump is constitutionally barred from running again, he's of course talking about his desire, perhaps floating the idea of a third term, but he can't run again. Why should he care about the polls? Does he care about the polls? Can't he just now do whatever he wants without thinking about public opinion?
Well, it is possible that he doesn't care. And there is a theory that, when he was, shot in the ear and survived and so forth, that he sort of, came to the conclusion that this was almost divine purpose. So I can't tell you whether or not he will moderate his behavior. Maybe the safe bet is that he won't. But what's going to happen is, as legislation has to pass in Congress, as court cases go forward, his abysmal public opinion polls are going to signal to all the institutions he's not 10 feet tall, he's very vulnerable. And in the midterms in 2026, it's almost 100% predictable the House will go to the Democrats. So Republicans in the Senate or in swing seats in the House are going to start realizing that's the existential threat, not Trump going after them. So just on a range of issues, there will be more and more constraints on him. Now, he may not change. He may say, I'm going to run for third term. I don't care what the Constitution says. He may do all that. But it is still a democracy. And the other institutions like the courts, the Congress, the media, the universities now, law firms are all seeing how vulnerable he is. So he may flail and he may say these things, but if you're worried about authoritarianism, you'd be worried if he had 60% support for his policies. But when he has this negative support, it's very hard to see how he does these things. He probably will say he's going to run again. You know, he doesn't want to look weak. He's going to do everything to try to look powerful. So the unpredictability, the volatility, the pugnaciousness, that's part of the deal. The actual ability to execute long-term and pass legislation and do things based on that, I think, is going to increasingly be diminishing.
Jared, just bouncing off that, I might ask you what you think of the state of the opposition to Trump is, I guess, perhaps also within the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party. There's obviously a huge difference to our system in that there's no opposition leader. From afar, it seems like there's no one who is a plausible rival, who is a plausible alternative president. Have you seen any signs of that emerging in the US?
No.
Anthony Albanese at the press club today.
So yeah, in 2017, we saw Nancy Pelosi, who was essentially the face of the opposition, seasoned many years of experience, and the Democrats were united in their opposition to Trump. But when Trump wins the popular vote, it's hard to stay united, and especially winning the popular vote a second time. And what united the sort of anti-Trump caucus from AOC and Bernie to even Dick Cheney is just that unifying force isn't there anymore. And there aren't many things less popular than Donald Trump right now in America, but there's one, and that's the Democratic Party. Yeah, maybe Tesla's, right. There really has not been any sort of coherent opposition to Trump in the Democratic Party, and you can see Democrats trying different things. You have the governor of California trying to platform previously unplatformable folks on his new podcast. You have the governor of Illinois trying to be a rapid response to Donald Trump. You have Cory Booker standing in Congress for 25 hours and somehow not going to the bathroom for that long, which is hard to imagine. You have all these people trying different things and nothing is really sticking just yet, but I think it's also way too early to say that nothing is sticking and they're going to be the Democrats in disarray forever. Let's not forget that it took a long time for Democrats to find their footing when George W. Bush won a second time. And it took months, I think August, September of 2005 on his second re-election when they finally started to get their footing. Now, in Republicans, I think, at the U.S. Studies Center, we host a lot of Republican delegations, Democratic delegations, congressional delegations, staff delegations. I have yet to meet Republicans who, behind closed doors, off the record, say that they love Donald Trump. Even anywhere close to what they say when the camera's on, right? And you can see this for yourself in the Senate in particular. The Senate GOP leader is a guy named John Thune. And he was up against a number of folks, including the senator from California, Charlie Crist, who was, not Charlie Crist, Rick Scott, excuse me. Rick Scott was full MAGA all the way, and he wanted to be the Senate GOP leader. And interestingly enough, the Senate GOP, in deciding their leadership, has a secret ballot. So Trump doesn't know who voted for him and who didn't. And lo and behold, the most anti-Trump Republican leader was chosen amongst the Senate Republicans, right? So I think the Republicans, as Mike was saying, as the polling numbers decrease, you'll start to see Republicans slowly distance themselves from Donald Trump more and more so. And as Mike was saying, the economic pain that Americans are seeing right now and the concern and the anxiety, there's so many stats, you've probably all seen them, whether it be about inflation, whether it be about right track, wrong track on the economy, that is only going to get worse. I don't know many economists outside of Peter Navarro who think it won't get worse. And so I think the opposition to Trump is not organized, is not necessarily unified, but is there and likely to grow in the coming months.
Peter, I think we should clear away, first of all, the Australian election, which is happening. We saw the results in Canada with the absolutely remarkable turnaround that has led to their Liberal Party being re-elected, the opposition leader being not even winning his seat again, seemingly because of the Trump factor. How is the Trump factor going to play out in the Australian election happening on Saturday? And if Anthony Albanese does win, is it because of Donald Trump?
Well, on the theme of getting it out of the way, I don't know if you saw the Batuta Advocate today. One of their top stories said, Australians jealous of Spain and Portugal 11-hour blackout. It's no coincidence that something like 4 million, 5 million Australians have voted already. Just get it over with, I think, is the underlying message there.
They weren't that enthused, they were just so excited to vote.
Of course.
Yeah.
Sausage, though, when we have so many people voting early.
Yeah. It just means there's going to be 2 for you, Catherine. So Trump hasn't directly intervened and changed the course of the election in the way that he has in Canada, where he's threatened to take over the country. But what he has done, and we saw this immediately when so-called Liberation Day occurred, we saw the mood changed. And this was reported immediately within 24 hours by people conducting focus groups and soon enough turned up in the polls. The mood changed in this way. Anybody flirting with the idea of change at this election became more wary and started to think more about reassurance. And in this election, reassurance means the status quo. And that accounted for a continuation of the pre-existing poll drift in favour of Labor. So I think a couple of things will pertain if Albanese wins, and the most unlikely outcome at this stage is a Peter Dutton majority. The second most unlikely is a Peter Dutton minority. Leaving the other hung parliament is unlikely. It's most likely a minority Albanese government or even a narrow Albanese government majority, based on everything we know at the moment. If Albanese wins, he won't give any credit to Donald Trump because he'll want all the credit for himself, but he does acknowledge that the mood changed, that the appetite for risk went down and the appetite for reassurance went up.
I do know the other day when Jacinta Price appeared and said at a rally that we need to make Australia great again, the people at Labor HQ were incredibly excited by that. Which made very clear, any sense that Donald Trump is coming into the campaign, they were very, very excited about. Catherine, I might draw you in here as someone who marshals our coverage of Trump, and I'm interested in this myself, having covered him over there. How are our readers feeling about Trump, as in how interested are they in reading about Donald Trump? I used to get the sense that it was a habit Australians would wake up kind of like checking into Neighbours or something, like a running soap opera, what's happening over there in Washington each morning. Is that still what's going on? And how do you think about how we cover such a controversial figure who's posed issues from day one for journalists of how to cover him and how to separate the signal from the noise?
He is very popular. He's one of our highest rating topics in our coverage. I think the time zone helps with the waking up thing, because people are waking up about 6 a.m. and logging on, and Michael Koziol's normally filed a story at about 4:55 a.m. for one of us to produce and get live for everybody to read when they wake up. There is a huge interest in what Donald Trump is doing, particularly the main areas where we've seen the most interest are regarding the tariffs, which makes sense because it affects Australians, and also the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the way Trump has expressed his views about that has resonated with people. There has been a lot of stories. It has been very busy, and some people, I think, are getting fatigued with that. Maybe it's a bit like chocolate, you shouldn't eat it, but you keep eating it anyway. We are trying to manage that by ensuring that what we put up is thoughtful, I guess. So we're not just publishing everything and anything. We're trying to identify stories that are of particular relevance to Australians or Australian audiences, or to sort of democracy more broadly, I guess. And we're looking for in-depth coverage and often trying to provide context around the news as well, with analysis pieces or something that pulls things together. So if it's a little bit bitsy, there's Trump does something here to AP, and then he does something else to the press corps. We might look at pulling those together into one story that talks about how he is dealing with traditional media compared to new media, for example. So we're trying to do a bit of both. I had a look before I came here tonight at how many stories Michael has filed from America since the inauguration, and he's filed 147 up to date, which equates, I think, probably to about 100,000 words. So he's written a PhD in 3 months. So I think one of my big challenges is trying to encourage him to have a day off.
Our appetite is insatiable, and this isn't the right event to talk about it, but it is an interesting conversation if it crowds out how much we can talk about other issues. For example, in the election campaign, we've had this issue flare up of a potential Russian aircraft being based in Indonesia. And I don't think many people knew much about Russia's influence in Indonesia, the deep ties there, how it's changing under the relatively new president. This is our own region that we don't pay enough attention to, so that's something I'm thinking about. But back to America, which is eternally fascinating. Maybe I'll work down the line, starting with Peter, and just get everyone to nominate if they have something that's surprised them from what we've seen from Donald Trump. We knew him very well as a figure from his first presidency. Has anything taken you by surprise this time around?
One element has, and it's my reason for being a little sceptical of Mike's earlier rather cheering scenario that we might have hit peak Trump, and that a gradual awakening of opposition, especially in the Congress and the Senate, might curb his scope for power in the next few years. And that is that even though he has the numbers in the Senate and the House, he has deliberately set about ruling without them. He has deliberately set about ruling by executive order, even when he knows it's going to bring him into lots of litigation, lots of opposition, lots of challenge. He's refused to honour congressional laws mandating spending. He's ignored some of those. He's, of course, ignored the Constitution. The Constitution says the Congress sets tariffs, not the President. on almost everything, he doesn't bother with the Congress. It's as if, it's not as if, I think he is laying the groundwork for one-man rule out of the White House and ignoring both houses of Congress. That's my suspicion. It's consistent with his line of thinking and rhetoric for a decade now. And that has surprised me. I thought he would use his congressional majority in both houses to rapidly pass laws which would be faster, less litigious or less litigable, and a more secure way of securing change. But he's gone out of his way to rule without the Congress. So that's why I'm a little more sceptical, I'm afraid, Mike. I'd like to be cheerful, but that's my surprise.
I don't know if I'd say I'm cheerful.
I was going to ask Peter, why do you think he has done that? Because I've also been quite intrigued by his use of executive orders, which is far higher than any other recent president.
I think it is against the day when he loses support in one or both of the chambers, and they won't bend to his will. I think he's setting up a template for dictatorial rule from the White House without reference to the legislature, just as he's want to ignore the Supreme Court, override the Constitution. I think he's preparing the way to ignore, override and sideline the Congress. Will he try to have the building physically shut down, as other dictators do in other countries? Who knows? We're at 100 days only. And to quote the great man himself, the very stable genius overnight, we've only just begun. You haven't seen anything yet.
So
that's what we're worried about, right?
Peter might be right that those thoughts are bouncing around in Donald Trump's head. I don't think he's particularly interested in how the Constitution works. I think he loves... Donald Trump in his career has been in more than 4,000 lawsuits. He loves the combat. He is a sort of genius at dominating the 24-hour news cycle. He's put out an average of 2 of these executive orders a day, and he's flooding the zone. Executive orders can be overturned in 20 minutes by the next president, all of them. And the reason he can't ignore Congress is because under the Constitution, and this part he can't do anything about, the Congress provides the budget. And that's coming up. And the very, very low opinion polls he has are going to put fear into not every Republican, but Republicans in swing districts, embolden Democrats. And polls this week on the 100 days, when Americans are asked, what do you think about Donald Trump defying the Supreme Court, only 6% of Americans, the most hardcore Trump supporters, say that would be okay. About 90% say no way. So I think he may be thinking that. I think the physics, the gravity, and by gravity I mean like weight, not seriousness, of politics, make that extremely difficult for him to do. But you may be right, that may be what he's thinking. I just don't see how he gets there. And when I say peak Trump, I don't mean Trump is going to get less manic or less, I don't think Michael's going to have fewer stories to write. I think what I mean is peak Trump power, the momentum that he has built up over 100 days. But this is all unprecedented, so I wouldn't rule out anything absolutely. I just think that the physics of it, because of the budget, because of the courts, and because of public opinion, in a federal system where states also have a huge say, doesn't add up.
Well, it would be lovely to think that the institutions can hold. He's obviously determined to break them all. But I'd just add one final thought on this, in this vein. You were talking, and Jared, about popularity and public approval and public support. Can I just quote Machiavelli? It's better to be feared than to be loved. And I think we might be seeing Trump's interest in exercising that adage pretty soon.
But I don't think he's going to be feared because of these numbers. On what surprised me, of course, we gathered here before the election, and Jared and I predicted most of what happened, so not much surprised us, of course. But I will say the one thing that did surprise me, and I think a lot of people, is the Doge Elon Musk role. And the critical piece was that his, 20-something computer science algorithm experts got access to the funding system in the Treasury and just randomly started canceling stuff, including like firing the guys who were in charge of guarding nuclear weapons. I mean, it was insane. And that had the despondency I saw in Washington was largely because of that. Just the self-damage to the U.S. government. It was only 4% of the U.S. federal workforce, but it was terrifying and disorienting for everyone. I think that was probably the biggest surprise, and frankly, gave him some momentum to keep going for a while.
And as you say that, I'm probably surprised that they're still getting along and Musk still seems to be there exercising influence. I thought they might have fallen out by now as there's been so much focus on him as a kind of shadow president actually running things. Catherine?
Yeah, well, I'm actually surprised. I found it a bit surprising that Musk, who has made so much money, didn't, well, I don't know, or that he took that he's allowed, I suppose, Tesla and his private interests to suffer so much. And he's now sort of said he's going to step back from Doge and move back into sort of looking after Tesla.
And people putting stickers on their Tesla saying, I bought this before
I
Donald
bought this
Trump was
before
re-elected.
Musk went crazy, or I think I found that sort of interesting to watch the Musk sort of dynamic, and I sort of keep asking myself, like, surely he must have foreseen that there was going to be a conflict here, because like so many people who buy Teslas are sort of progressive, left-leaning, politically sort of aligned to the left, and progressive thinker, identifies progressive. So, a lot of the things that Musk has done, or that Trump has done, are obviously those customers are not going to be necessarily very happy with it. So, I was a bit surprised that that happened, and that from how it looks, he didn't foresee that effect on his own brands of his products. But maybe he did, but it's an interesting business move if he did.
Sure.
Yeah. But I also found it surprising I've also found it a bit surprising that there hasn't been more opposition from Republicans towards him, as you might see in Australian politics when we have, a tight balance in the House, and you have some MPs sort of stand up and try and push a little more against the party line to get things for themselves or for their own voters. And we haven't seen that in America, but Mike and Jared were explaining in a little call yesterday that you'd be surprised to see opposition in the first 100 days.
And I don't know if they're cowardly, but some have spoken about they're quite afraid, perhaps for their even physical safety, to stand up against Donald Trump, or certainly their careers, but they're actually afraid of what could happen to them. Jared?
Yeah, just quickly on the maybe Trump supporters embracing Tesla. It's also interesting to me how the MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again, has adopted some of the key talking points from the much aligned by Republicans campaign by Michelle Obama about eating healthy. Funny how things turn depending on who's in the White House and who's saying what. So similarly to Mike, the Doge cuts were the most surprising to me and unexpected. But I think it's important maybe for this audience to understand why those Doge cuts are happening. Because people have said that America is basically one big insurance company with a big army. Because if you look at the budget and what the U.S. spends money on, it is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then the military. And so Trump has made very clear, he's one of the first Republicans in modern history to say, I'm not going to be cutting any of those, what Republicans call entitlements, right? The social safety net of the US. And most Republicans campaigned on reforming it or modernizing it, euphemisms for cutting it. And Trump has said, I'm not going to touch it. And maybe congressional Republicans might change it, let's see where we are on July 4. But anyway, Trump has campaigned on not doing that. But what they are doing is they're doing cuts in a way that really anger Democrats and really anger their political enemies. And in this negative partisan era that we're in, the enemies, the tears of my enemy are a win, right? And so in a way, Trump is giving them like the tears of the libs, but he's not actually delivering budget cuts, because those budget hawks in Congress, the Republicans in Congress who want to cut the budget, he's hoping he can just give them these political wins, but maybe not budgetary wins, if that makes sense. And so I don't see him changing his stance on social safety net anytime soon, but I think to understand why he's doing it explains what the point of it is. Like, those cuts to the federal workforce are nothing compared to, in the whole light of what the U.S. spends on its budget. Discretionary spending in the U.S. is just not that much compared to the entitlements. Last thing I'll just add in terms of things that surprised me is how quickly things have moved. One, how Trump started with the best polling of his entire life when he first took office. He did not have a single day as a net positive in his first term. That means more people approved than disapproved. Except then, when he started office here, he had 2 months of that. 2 months of a net positive polling average. And then now he has a net negative, obviously, and it is only getting worse. We have never seen a president basically use up all their political capital this quickly. And last thing I'll just add to my prior point about like finding a Democratic opposition is to try to predict who the face of the Democratic opposition at this point is a fool's errand. Let's not forget what happened the last time a Republican won a second term of office with George W. Bush in 2004. The Democrats had a powwow that said, you know what, we are going to go more rural, we're going to go for a military veteran with a long rural background, and then they chose Barack Obama. And then in 2012, the Republicans lost to Barack Obama for a second time. They are another second term of a president. And the Republicans said, we have to go more urban, we have to go more diverse, we really have to go younger, and they went with Donald Trump. So trying to predict who is going to be the next presidential candidate for the Dems, or the next leader of the Dems, I think is a fool's errand. And there's far too many issues to come up between now and then.
Mike, has Trump done anything that's commendable, that's good from your perspective?
He's increased participation on our events and readership of your paper.
And that's not nothing.
That's not nothing. Yeah, I mean, it was draconian, and the public doesn't approve of the way he did it, but illegal immigration is down to a trickle. That was one thing voters said they wanted. They're not happy about how it's happening, but that was a promise delivered. The pivot to Asia, the military pivot, is much more real under Trump so far than it was under Biden or Obama or Bush.
In what way?
Well, the administration and the Congress are going to increase defense spending by 12.5% in the next fiscal year. And within the overall defense budget, there's a significant shift. All previous presidents talked about pivoting to the Indo-Pacific. There's a significant shift, so much so that the Republican chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Wicker, said that's too fast. So Republicans are actually criticizing the administration. They say that's too fast. You're cutting Army and Europe and NATO too much. So I think if you care about the military side of Asia policy, there is a very pronounced increase in that. Again, the way it's happening may not be worth the result, but polls show that a majority of Americans, our polls as well, are strongly supportive of alliances, especially with Australia, but NATO too. But 2/3 say our allies should be paying more. The U.S. pays 3% plus of GDP on defense. Canada pays like 1.3% or something. Australia's 2%. Japan's going to 2%. So the public does feel that Europe in particular should be spending more on defense, and that's happening. So now, the collateral damage to get there, you could argue was not worth it, but there are some results that the public and the national interest would say are good. It just may not be worth the way we did it.
Now,
I think from a media point of view, he has brought a lot of focus onto issues that are important, and has got people talking about issues that people perhaps were not talking about as much anymore. Like, he's put a lot of focus on Gaza and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which were, I think, probably, while everyone knew they were happening, they'd kind of tuned out a little bit. So I think that you could probably see that as a positive, that it has encouraged public conversation about those conflicts and the future of those places as well.
Peter, feel free to give Trump some praise if you'd like, but I did want you to talk a little bit about a column you wrote recently, which argued that Trump's America is becoming more and more like Xi Jinping's China every day. Now that's a striking argument to make, given what we know about China's political system. Can you say briefly why you think that that analogy is useful?
Sure. On the first point about the good works that King Donald might have performed, inadvertently, I think he's done Western civilization outside the US a big favour. Number one, he's awakened Europe from its pacifist torpor, where it was prepared to allow, where it was not sufficiently alert to the dangers of the great predators now stalking the earth. Primary concern for Europeans, of course, being Putin, whom they were worried about, but not actually motivated to do much about, apart from write checks. Now, that's Trump's return has really alarmed the leaders and the peoples of Europe, of Western Europe in particular, and Eastern Europe perhaps even more, and that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing, because the world had two great predators stalking it. It had Putin and Xi Jinping. Well, now, and the US had always been a predator, but it was our predator. It was on our team, and now it's become a predator on its allies as well. Greenland, its Danish NATO ally, Canada, and all the other actions as well. So that's one good thing. And the second good thing, the second favour I think he's done Western civilization, is he's stopped the international drift to a pugilistic right-wing populism, stopped it dead in its tracks. In the way we saw Poilievre in Canada stopped dead in his tracks, and the election won by the Liberal Party, in the way that we saw Peter Dutton and some of the Libs and Nats embracing Trump and Trumpisms because they thought it was such a winning strategy. He's now become unspeakable, literally, because this morning, I don't know if you saw this, the deputy leader of the Liberal Party, Susan Lee, was being interviewed on Sky News, and the reporter said to her, well, now that Donald Trump has said that he's going to call the Prime Minister of Australia, whoever that is after the election, you'd be hoping that that's going to be Donald Trump will be ringing Peter Dutton, right? And Trump has become so radioactive that she avoided the question. She avoided the question. She said, oh, well, our priorities are, and waffled about something else. So she can't even mention the possibility of phone contact now between Peter Dutton as Prime Minister and Donald Trump. This is pretty extraordinary. And elsewhere in the world as well. That movement, and I'm not talking about that he's punished, right-wing political parties, but the sort of pugilistic, anti-democratic, populist, and I like to be specific about populism because there are many definitions. Populism, the definition that I prefer, is a political style that offers unworkably simplistic solutions to complex problems. And that movement, I think, has now been slapped in the face by the way Trump has ruled in the US and the political and public opinion effects that's produced. So thank you, Donald. I think we can thank him for those two things. Just very briefly on your reference to the column I wrote, and I know Mike said that he is in vehement disagreement, so this could be a fun discussion. For the last few decades, the West assumed that with political opening and increasing prosperity, China would become more like the West, that it would become that people enjoying the freedoms and latitudes of being wealthy consumers, savers and investors, and able to travel the world, which of course the Chinese weren't able to do for many decades, would produce a demand for political freedoms, and China would become more democratic and therefore more like us. In fact, the reality, in my view, is the exact opposite, and that what Trump is doing is taking the US to make it more like China, less democratic, less interested in fundamentals of democracy and the whole Western liberal order, such as the separation of powers we were talking about earlier, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And he's not interested in that, and he's smashing it down. And that's at the core of China's rule. But I wrote an entire column on that, and there's much more there. But that's the brief overview.
Is that not fair, Mike, given we're seeing people shipped off to other countries and they should be coming back and they're not? You know, is it not a fair comparison to draw?
Well, for sure, Donald Trump's, what did you call it, pugilistic right-wing populism?
Something like that.
Has...
I'll just write that down.
It was very good. Has echoes or resonates with Xi Jinping's pugilistic left-wing neo-Maoist authoritarian populism in China. There's a bit of an echo between the two. And it makes it easier for the Chinese to claim or try to claim moral ascendancy, and you know, Xi is now claiming China is going to save the international liberal order. And it damages American soft power. The Lowy poll showed 36% of Australians trust the US right now. In Japan and Korea, the numbers are about the same. So it definitely echoes or sort of blurs the distinction between democracy and authoritarianism in ways that are unhelpful for the US. However, Xi Jinping does not face a Congress that determines his budget, courts that rule on his decisions, a public that can, there is no public opinion polling in China, governors who are independently elected, universities, I mean, the list is long.
MSNBC,
yeah.
CNN.
I mean, there's a world of difference in terms of, and the main area where I disagree is Donald Trump may have this vision, but that's not the vision the American people have. It's very clear in the polls. I'm not at all surprised the Democrats aren't you know, choosing a leader to fight back. That's how the Westminster system works. It's not how our presidential system works. It takes years to pick the leader. And actually, if you want to slow down Donald Trump, the last thing you want is for the Democrats to pick a leader. Napoleon said, when your enemy's making a mistake, get out of the way. And Clinton's guru, James Carville, has been saying to the Democrats, just shut up. Let him just destroy his... So that's a humongous difference. And the other difference I'd have... by the way, it's a very provocative piece that I sent back to Washington just to stimulate people, so good on you in that sense. But the other thing is, while 36% of Australians, similar numbers of Japanese and Koreans say, gosh, we can't trust the US right now, support for the alliance in that Lowy poll was 80% in Australia. In Japan and Korea, it's 90%. You know, there's a scene, I think I might have quoted this in the last time we met, but in the early Reagan years, Reagan was seen by the Europeans as unilateralist, and you know, he was asked, how will the Cold War end? And he said, easy, we win, they lose. The Europeans had never heard such shocking stuff. And they were all complaining about the Americans in an early meeting, and the British Foreign Secretary said, yes, everything you say about the Americans is true, but they're the only Americans we have. And so I don't see any evidence, I challenge you to show me any evidence that any major US ally or partner right now is going to throw away 70 years of alliance relations, deep economic interdependence. Just think about the Australian Defence Force's kit. You're going to throw away what you get from the US? No. So the third point I make is no government is making that conclusion. But where Peter's right is it blurs the distinction between authoritarianism and democracy in ways that are, above all, unhelpful to American foreign policy.
And really, my point is the direction, the drift in which the US is heading, not the absolute outcome. Of course, the US is a vastly freer and more robust place, but I'd also add the final thought that the Chinese Communist Party, the world's most successful, most durable one-party state, has been refining it for nearly 80 years. Donald Trump has been there, as we know, for 100 days.
But the question is that the future or is that an aberration?
Well, let's discuss that at the
we'll
next...
have to do this again in 100 days.
Our next conference.
You come back every 100 days and just assess. Did you want to say something, Jared, and then we'll go to audience questions?
add, as similarities between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, the best thing that has ever happened to the U.S. alliance system in Asia is Xi Jinping, hands down. And anyone would admit, Americans would readily admit that American politics has been a bit of a dumpster fire the last decade and a half, right? Yet somehow the polling shows that support for their alliance and for working with the U.S. has remained pretty high, higher than during the Iraq War. Why is that? That's not because we're more attractive or more charismatic in the US. It is because Xi Jinping is forcing them there. So that's one big difference in my mind, is that Donald Trump provides a lot of uncertainty. I don't think Xi Jinping does. We know with a pretty high degree of certainty what he wants, and we don't like it in the US, Japan, Korea, Australia, and so forth.
But I guess he also would have learned a lot from the first term. I think in many ways China didn't play their hand very well. They had a climate-denying US president, and China decided to go down a path of wolf warrior diplomacy that put people off almost equally as much at the time. I'm thinking about countries that are trying to choose between, we've already seen Xi Jinping go to Southeast Asia and present himself as a more likable figure compared to Trump. It'll just be interesting to see how that goes the second time around, because he's had the chance to learn. Yeah.
Sorry, very quickly, there's polling on this. ICS in Southeast Asia. Sorry, pollster dies hard. There's polling on this in Southeast Asia of what they think of China and what they think of the US that just came out, last month, I believe? And pretty high approval of the US. Right? And it's not like Trump was hiding or somehow they didn't talk about Trump. Again, this is not because America is somehow more attractive, but because of the threat environment and the perception of China.
The survey came out right before the Liberation Day tariffs. So, probably the ICS, the Singapore-based think tank, would get a more negative result about the US. But the depth of distrust of China that came out in that poll across Southeast Asia, especially in places like the Philippines, not surprisingly, or Vietnam, it was very deep. It was very.
China has only doubled down on the export-led growth and flooded not just the U.S. and European markets with cheap goods, but Southeast Asia as well. I don't think that's covered a lot in the media, but the negative sentiment towards China is pretty significant.
Okay, so we'll take questions from the crowd. Is there a microphone here? Okay, maybe this gentleman here first, and I'll...
Good evening. What do you make of the meeting between Trump and Zelensky at Francis's funeral?
Mike, anyone?
It's better than their first meeting.
Yeah. Can't deny that.
So Donald Trump's art of the deal is, I think, to 4,000 lawsuits, so use everything you have for leverage, break, threaten, challenge, but don't define what your objective actually is. And that's the case with tariffs. The tariffs are supposed to raise revenue, they're supposed to bring manufacturing back to the US, and they're supposed to get rid of unfair trade barriers in other countries. Those three are mutually incompatible. If you succeed in lowering trade barriers, why would manufacturing come back to the US? If it's for revenue, you can't get rid of the tariffs to negotiate on trade. And so the way he tends to succeed in politics and business is by deciding what victory is and declaring it. And he clearly dislikes Zelensky. There's a history there, as we know. There's a fascination with Putin, we know that. And there is a belief around Trump that strategically the US has got to cauterize this Ukraine wound so we can focus on China. So it's still not unfavorable for Zelensky in Ukraine compared to before, but Vladimir Putin is playing Donald Trump for a fool. And Trump does not like to look like a loser. So I think that it has shifted. I still think that pressures on Ukraine to make concessions for sure, but the dynamic I think has shifted. Yeah.
I think I've found it quite interesting watching how different foreign leaders have prepared themselves for a meeting with Trump, and how they've carried themselves or managed themselves in the Oval Office. And I think Zelensky, I am kind of impressed with how he played that one at the Vatican, because I think the optics of it were very impressive for Donald Trump. You know, the idea of being in the Basilica and, you know, the Pope's body still being there when they're meeting, the two of them face to face in this holy sort of place designed by Michelangelo. I mean, it's quite, you know, and then by Zelensky saying at the end of it that it was potentially historic. I think he did a good job of, you know, giving Trump, I imagine, what he would like out of that. So in terms of watching the diplomacy, it was, I think, very interesting to see that and to compare that with their meeting in the Oval Office, which, you know, Zelensky had apparently been briefed by various European leaders before that meeting, but clearly it did not go to plan. And I think a lot of thought had probably gone into that meeting at the Vatican from Zelensky and his allies, I imagine.
I'll just put my cards on the table. Mike and I have both made submissions to Parliament about the necessity of Australia supporting Ukraine. So I'm not hiding anything. And the reason for that is ultimately the more that Australia supports Europe, the more that hopefully we can get Europe to support Australia in the Indo-Pacific into contingency, right? Europe can be the ultimate spoiler on any sort of contingency in the region if they provide a lifeline to China economically. Now, what I wanted to quickly add is I wanted to add that context for navigating, understanding the value of Ukraine and Russia, but also in what we think of it, but also the fact that I don't think Mike or I really want to say that this is a turning point for Trump on Ukraine. We've seen time and time again that he is not someone who has a strategy, not someone who thinks long-term. He's someone who thinks of every day as a new fight. And so, yes, he had a positive meeting with Zelensky, but if he tomorrow comes out with a terrible Truth Social post about Zelensky, would we be surprised? No.
Michael Koziol, in one of his analysis pieces after that meeting, said that you know, he tends to just sort of take on the views of the person he's last spoken to, and express, you know, some sort of questions over the sort of long-term effect of that meeting.
I think the term is strong opinions weakly held.
Yeah. I'll come to the front row here, if we don't mind.
Yeah, many scholars and former officials in Beijing comparing second Trump presidency to the Cultural Revolution and period marked by the institutional collapse and national chaos. How should we interpret this analogy in today's context? Do you see this is a warning about this risk of dismantling global institution and trade framework without viable alternative? And more broadly, what does this signal about how other regimes, particularly those shaping global trade and geopolitics alliances, perceive the stability and credibility of the US under such leadership?
Peter, that might be for you. I have heard, I think Anne Applebaum, for example, has spoken about the idea of a cultural revolution happening in America. Do you think there are parallels there?
Absolutely. Two quick thoughts on that. This morning I turned on Fox News, which...
As you do every morning.
Yeah, you know, when you get out of bed, you're feeling a bit, you know, maybe a bit grumpy, a bit curmudgeonly, you know, annoyed at having to get up. And so if you want to cheer up, you just turn on Fox News. Brightens the mood, the sun comes out, and I skip down the garden path to go to work. No, but because it's a parallel universe of argument, rhetoric, and thinking, we need to tap into it at least as much as we tap into the other one. And I heard one of the presenters lauding the way that Trump is conducting. Now, she didn't use the term cultural revolution, but he said the great thing Trump is doing is he's taking the war into the cultural institutions of the enemy. He's taking it into the universities. He's taking it into the sanctuary cities, so-called. He's taking it into the law firms, and he's just going for them and tearing it all up. And this was a tremendous thing, which he likened to Hannibal's, the general who led Carthage against Rome with the elephants across the Alps into Italy. He likened it to that, which I didn't think was very well researched because ultimately Hannibal lost, but let's get over that one. And that is exactly what he's doing, how I think that whole MAGA movement sees it. What's this got to do with the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong? The parallel is that Mao wanted to destroy elites. He waged a war on knowledge, information, science, because he saw it as antithetical to absolute loyalty to himself, that there could be any higher truth or fact or reality higher than himself. And to achieve his aims of subduing all enemies, the overriding tool was chaos, violent chaos. Now, Trump hasn't resorted to violent chaos. He has supported violent chaos. He has suggested in his first term as president to the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs that he should shoot protesters during the Black Lives Matter protests. You'll remember Trump said, according to the general, why don't you just shoot them in the legs? So we know that he may have an appetite for violent chaos. We haven't got there yet. But chaos there is indeed. And all of those are close parallels, trying to produce a cultural revolution, yes, but more importantly, what Mao was really after was to subdue all opposition and to be absolute ruler. And I think those parallels hold.
Mao started the Cultural Revolution from the position of absolute supreme power in China at a time in Chinese history where institutions were nascent and almost entirely controlled by the party which he controlled. So there are some parallels. I mean, there is a cultural dimension of this. This is for the core sort of MAGA people, this is about punishing the bi-coastal elite, San Francisco, Harvard, Washington, New York, Chicago. And there is that sort of Cultural Revolution dimension. But Mao's China was entirely different. And the American people like a little revolution, but not too much. So the American Revolution was a revolution, but it was ultimately really a restoration of the rights of landholders as Englishmen. It wasn't meant to be independence, it became independence. But it also had that revolutionary flavor with Thomas Paine and the last great hope of mankind. So Americans, more than Australians, like words like liberty and like a little revolution, but just a little. And they mainly voted for Trump on inflation, immigration, and there was a broad sense in the public that the sort of woke, if you will, cultural stuff had gone too far to the left, and there needed to be a correction. But that's not why most of them voted for him. That's why the Fox News commentators voted for him. And that's why you get about a third of Americans who support what he's doing, and about 2/3 who don't. And that includes on the attacks on Harvard and universities. About 2/3 of Americans think that that's not a good idea. About 2/3 of Americans say he's creating too much chaos. So America's like a little revolution. But as the founding fathers did, you put that revolution in the box. But I will say, when I was there a month ago, people were all talking about Cultural Revolution, because it did feel like that. But I think that it goes as far as it goes.
I kind of got to wonder a little bit what the end game is. Like, what does Trump want America to be in 3.5 years? I mean, if he's, constitutionally he can't run again, and you've sort of got to ask, like, what's he trying to achieve? Like, what is he seeing as his legacy, I guess?
He wants to win the golf tournament at Mar-a-Lago on a global scale. It's pretty clear. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be Times Man of the Year. It's not really. I mean, we're psychoanalyzing, and none of us are psychiatrists. But I don't think it's really about what America or the world looks like. It's about, how much does Donald Trump get time at the end of the year, or whatever accolades he can get. And that's why, I'm stealing Jared's line, but that's why when Henry Kissinger was asked about Donald Trump, he said, look, sometimes in history, you have a figure who comes along who reminds you that or demonstrates that the system you thought existed isn't there anymore. And Donald Trump has done that. And then the journalist asked, so does Donald Trump have a plan for what comes next? And I think Kissinger said something like, no, he doesn't. He's really just an accident. And I think it's partly, and that's why he doesn't have a clear strategy for what this looks like. And that's why within his administration you have groups like the Stephen Miller anti-immigration group, and then the Peter Navarro protectionist group, and then the the sort of hawkish on China Marco Rubio, Hegseth group, and there are 5 or 6 different strategies, and he sort of picks, one at a time, but they don't all fit together. When I worked in the White House, we would meet in the Situation Room so that the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, they would debate things like tariffs or diplomatic agreements. So you consider the repercussions, whether your allies were with you, and there's none of that process. It's The Apprentice. It's a TV show. And so that's why I don't think there is a long-term strategy, and that's why I don't think it's going to be legislated and institutionalized and made permanent. The bad news about what I'm saying is that's not a process you want in a crisis. Having worked in the White House 5 years, I want to 100% discount what Peter's saying, but that's not, I think, the problem. I think the problem is what happens if we have another pandemic, or if we have
I was going to say, we saw that once.
Or we have a conflict over Taiwan. I think probably the right people will get into the Oval Office and be the last ones to talk to him, but the way this process works, which is to say there isn't really a process, that's the part that worries me. Just to let you know, I'm not all sunny and happy.
That's a relief. Look, I just want to add a footnote here. Now, Mike is right when he says that Mao was already in a commanding position when he launched the Cultural Revolution. But these guys are all paranoid, and you cannot reassure a paranoid dictator that you're secure. So Mao launched the Cultural Revolution with the famous line, "Let 100 flowers bloom." And the point of that was not because he was fond of gardening, wasn't because he really genuinely wanted pluralism. It was because he wanted to draw out his enemies by giving the impression that he was interested in reform, and this was an opportunity for alternative ideas and movements. And when when they'd revealed themselves, that's when he crushed them. What did Donald Trump promise us about his second term in power? He said, for all of you who are feeling wronged, I am your vengeance. And as Steve Bannon said, he actually said it in an interview with me a few weeks before the last election, he said, we are coming after all our enemies, every one of them. Don't you doubt that for a moment.
So the challenge for the Sydney Morning Herald or a think tank or a business is how to assess agency, what Donald Trump says, does, wants to do, and structure. And that's any world event, any historical event. Those are the things you're trying to make sense of. The difference between me and Peter is I don't totally disagree on the definition of Donald Trump's, what he would like his agency to be necessarily. I maybe differ a little. Where we disagree is on the structure. And it's just, I think, frankly, although you can't use agency and structure in newspaper articles, I imagine that's what you're trying to do as well and trying to figure out. Because Donald Trump, shock and awe, is saying all kinds of outrageous things and threatening all kinds of outrageous things. That's part of the point.
Seriously and literally, we're always trying to toss it up. Anyone in this section? There's someone in a tie at the back.
Thank you. It was noted that these are early days and that Trump's polling numbers have declined, but of the polling that I've seen, they don't seem to go much lower than 40%, which from what I know is very much in line with other recent presidents. And so my question is there perhaps a bar or a level which Trump's approval rating will not go below? And what does that mean for the more traditional spectrum of Republicans, whether they be the Bush types or the Collins types? Thank you.
I was going to say, I think it seems like there's about a third at least of America who would find it pretty impossible to break away from Trump. He has his famous quote about shooting someone on 7th Avenue. He hasn't done that, but he has been convicted of crimes. He triggered an insurrection. We saw what happened in the COVID pandemic, and he still had about a third of support. If you go to his rallies and speak to people, it's a very devotional atmosphere. It's not necessarily about specific policies. I don't think they're going to break away from him. That's probably 30%, 35% of the American population, I'd say.
Michael Koziol has just done a bit of a road trip through Republican states in the lead up to the 100-day mark, and was talking to quite a lot of Republicans, including like the soybean farmer who has voted for Trump 3 times, and he is advocating for relief from the tariffs that are going to affect his farm. He's about to plant this big crop of soybeans that China generally buys, and yet he's still backing Trump. So, I think it's politics of identity in a way, isn't it? Like, it's very difficult for people to move away from something that they identify as being who they are.
His polls have been support rate has been between 39 and 42% this past week in close to 10 polls. That's 10 to 15 points below any other president at this point. And usually they're well above 60, 70% is usually where they are. So it's pretty low. And I think it will go lower because the impact of the tariffs is going to get worse. People are going to feel it more. But there is also a kind of a floor for him. It's probably about 34, 35%. And in the polls about specific policies, it's interesting. You'll get 60 to 68% who say, I don't like the tariff policy, I don't like this. You'll get 90% who say he shouldn't be messing with the courts. But you get a consistent 34, 35% who say, nope, he's good, love him. And so I would be not expecting him to fall below 35%. But if he's in the 30s when they're doing this big budget bill, or when people are getting ready for their midterm election run, that's very significant for the calculation of enough Republicans. And I wouldn't look for Republicans to stand up and say, darn it, I'm done with him. What happened last time was I'll give you, so I testified in the Congress about North Korea, and this congressman from Florida who was the chair said, Dr. Green, how can we help Donald Trump make history with North Korea? And then when the cameras were off, he said, we've got to stop him. And they introduced legislation praising President Trump for diplomacy in North Korea, whereas, and then saying you cannot pull troops out of Korea without congressional approval. And so it wasn't people giving speeches, it was subterfuge, frankly. The polling numbers are getting low enough that I think you will see more and more of that. I don't think Donald Trump will change. He will continue saying, I'm going to run for 3rd term. I want to annex Queensland. I made that one up. We're going to still see that. And we're still going to see deportations, and we're still going to see attacks on judges and stuff. But the politics more broadly, I think, the polls we're already seeing are actually historically low and are likely to get worse.
I was going to say, I do think, sorry, it's not poll related, you just reminded me. I do think it's interesting how his rhetoric towards Australia is generally much more favourable and friendly than it is to other places, which I think is interesting. Like, I feel like we're getting a bit of an easier ride than Europe, for example.
Prime Minister Trudeau went on late-night American comedy shows during the American election and made fun of Donald Trump.
No, not a good
And
move.
by the way, it was funny. But he remembers that stuff. I can't even imagine Prime Minister Albanese on a late-night comedy show, let alone making fun of Donald Trump. So he remembers that stuff. It's a lot of it's about vengeance.
I'll just very quickly add, we'd like to look at things that are precedented and unprecedented in terms of that 35% for that rusted-on support for Trump. Same thing applies to Democrats and Biden. 35%, that's not going to go. And they've done polling recently in the last couple of weeks on percentage of Americans who regret their vote for Harris or Trump, and it was 1 to 2%.
Is there a question over here? This gentleman, yep.
Thank you for the very interesting discussion. Just for context, I'm actually Australian-US dual national and been living in the US for the last 30 plus years. So I was, I've got a lot of questions I could ask, but I thought maybe a good one might be, what do you think Australia is going to have to pay, and I don't mean that necessarily financially, in order to remain under the US umbrella? Because the US is moving from alliances to more of a vassal state tribute system. And I see Peter Hartcher nodding his head. This has been incredibly dramatic over the last 100 years. My friends cannot believe what's happening. I've been there this whole time. We're heading to, I don't know if Australians, some I think get it, some really don't yet get where things are heading. So maybe that's a good question. What is Australia going to have to pay?
Peter, are we going to have to pay 3% of GDP on defense to defend ourselves because we can't count on America, and the Trump administration wants us to spend more?
Well, I think you used the expression umbrella, specifically on the nuclear umbrella. Just one very brief but profoundly important strand of current world politics. The foreign minister of South Korea has said that a homegrown nuclear defense for South Korea is now on the table, has to be on the table. And just this week I saw Kurt Campbell, the former Democrat Deputy Secretary of State, saying in an interview with the Nikkei in Japan that he thinks Tokyo should also be thinking more about how to contribute to the nuclear umbrella, to developing an indigenous nuclear defense to work with, ostensibly with the US, which is, considering Japan's history and its identification as the world's foremost anti-nuclear pacifist nation, is extraordinary. And these are powerful hallmarks of the level of distrust of Trump that is now stalking all the capitals of the world. Vassal state tribute, yes, you see it whenever Trump deals with any other country. Okay, Ukraine, peace, yeah, sure, but let's get your critical minerals. I want access to your critical minerals. Greenland, I want their critical minerals. Wherever he goes, in the last few days, he signed an executive order to accelerate the exploitation of seabed mining resources, which threatens to open up an entirely new range of multi-level clashes over sovereignty, over resource ownership, over the environment. Scraping the ocean floor on an industrial scale would be a pretty new thing to do. He's very much extractive. Drill, baby, drill, and he'll take that from whatever country he can get it. Now, obviously, the Australian government had already been talking to the Biden administration for years about access to critical minerals in Australia. We've got a bunch, we don't develop them. There's only one really functional processing, rare earth processing business in Australia, Lynas, which ships the minerals to its plant in Malaysia for processing. What the Australian government is trying to do is get US capital to co-develop resources and process them here. Now, they've put that on the table. Kevin Rudd has put that on the table with Trump's people. That is still on the table. There is yet to be a response from the Trump administration to that proposal. We don't know the detail of it. We have heard Albanese in the last 3 days talk about Australia developing, his government has committed $1.2 billion to creating a strategic reserve of rare earths and critical minerals in Australia to help to try and break the Chinese stranglehold on what is now close to a global monopoly on the rare earths that you need to do everything from make your mobile phone work. Your typical mobile phone has 8 different rare earth elements in it, to missile guidance technology and everything in between. You need this stuff. I think the Australian government calculation is that Trump will find that a very attractive offer. And given the way he conducts himself with other countries and their mineral resources, I suspect they might be right. I don't know what else is going to be involved. 3% of GDP wouldn't be too difficult. Australia's average during the Cold War was 2.7, so 3% is hardly a great stretch. and the Liberal Party's already committed to it.
I heard champagne corks popping as you were talking, so someone's excited. We'll take a couple more, and then I have to wrap up. But I want to get a couple more questions. This younger gentleman here.
Hello. I'm going to quickly say my dad reads the Sydney Morning Herald every morning, so I'm going to brag about this to him. Jesus. So my question is for the Herald team. What is like the craziest story or event that you just couldn't believe you were writing about and covering, and also, do you ever get anxious about having to cover something really bad?
I don't. Well, I'm just editing rather than reporting, so I get anxious about the headlines and making sure there's no spelling mistakes in them. But I think the craziest one that's come out has probably been that AI-generated Gaza video, which was intriguing to watch. And when it came out, it sort of came out sort of late afternoon our time, which was a bit late for Michael, our correspondent, to file on it. So we waited for the morning to do that one, and I thought it was important to get him to write that with context rather than just sort of report the video. So he ended up writing an analysis piece based on that video, which I think was important in putting it in the context of Trump's eagerness to flood the zone, and the fact that at the time there was a whole lot of conversations going on about Ukraine, which I think he was getting a bit frustrated with. And so I think the timing of that Gaza video was very interesting because it sort of came just before that Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office, and just before he met Keir Starmer, just after he'd met Macron. So there was all this talk about Ukraine and the US, and it was more complicated than when he had been talking about Gaza a few weeks ago. So I think the timing of that video was very interesting, and so for us, rather than just taking it and putting it out there, it was important to try and build that context into it. So we did actually delay writing about it till we could do that, which I think was the right call.
Well, the first Trump administration was crazy in many ways. That the COVID period when I was there and the Black Lives Matter movement started was a really kind of dangerous time in America and in Washington. I remember being down near the White House late at night. There was a curfew, but lots of protesters setting fire to cars right only a couple of blocks from the White House, and buildings, people smashing into things. This was probably a few days after Trump was talking about using kind of exotic detergents to treat the virus. Everyone had basically otherwise left the city. Everything was boarded up. I was kind of there, didn't really know anyone. That was a really surreal and strange time where it did feel like this isn't really real. And the daily Trump press conferences where he was talking about this virus is going to disappear in a day or two, whereas you are living with it, calling up my parents in Australia saying, you've got to take this thing very seriously, but the president was saying not to worry. That was pretty crazy. I felt like I was having to hold on to my sense of reality. Yeah.
I think as a reporter, and I'm sure Matthew and Peter will agree, that when there is a big story, often you just file. Often I find I file my best. I've written my best work when it's a big crazy moment. It's kind of like, it's amazing where adrenaline can get you in wanting. It's almost like a need to get the story out of your head and onto the paper. And do you find that too?
Yes, definitely. The adrenaline's very, very powerful. Yeah.
Just quickly add, we work with DFAT all the time. I was literally just flew in from Canberra working to talking to DFAT, and it's really interesting that the Australian diplomats who were in DC for the first Trump term, they all almost unanimously say that it was terrifying because Trump was so unconventional and did not have any standard interagency process whatsoever. And it was also exciting because Trump was so unconventional and did not have any interagency process whatsoever. I just want to highlight that because as much as we talk about Australia's relationship with the US and how Trump is a challenge, Australia has never had more influence, impact, and presence in DC than it has now. It is more consequential in DC than, in my view, the history of the U.S.-Australia alliance. And I don't think that we should miss that point.
I mean, the embassies in Washington that have real access are basically Australia, Japan, UK. Sometimes the Saudis and the Israelis. So Australia's in a very, very elite group. The problem Kevin Rudd or Arthur Sinodinos or Michael Foley has is they can't tell the Sydney Morning Herald that. They can't come out of these meetings and say, I just convinced that idiot in the White House, Mike Green, to totally change America's East Timor policy. Whoops. A lot of agency. The other thing is Australia's brand for Americans, not that Americans understand a lot about Australia, but it's almost perfect. And we did an experiment at CSIS, the think tank I worked at in Washington. We asked a very large-scale survey of Americans, how much risk would you take to defend the following countries if they're threatened by China? This is just a few years ago, from 1 to 10, with 10 being, not defined, but maximum risk. The mean for Japan was 9.5, Korea was 8. Australia was the highest in the world with a mean of 9 with the American public. The mean was, we'll take from a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, we're ready for 9. So that plus Five Eyes, there's an awful lot of structure to this alliance and this relationship. And the U.S. needs Australia more than it ever has, which is partly why there's influence. It's not just critical minerals, it's geography and a lot of other things. So Australia has agency here. It's not going to be easy navigating it, but Australia is in a much better position than a lot of countries to actually take care of itself, and has a lot of people inside the administration. I'd say almost everyone, except Peter Navarro maybe. So you'd rather be Kevin Rudd than, say, I don't know, many other ambassadors.
On a lighter note, in response to your question, this isn't exactly a crazy story, but just thinking through, and probably the influence of sitting next to Matthew in his aura has just jogged my memory about the time a couple of years ago, I think, when you and I went to interview Caroline Kennedy. Yes. Do you remember that? In the ambassador's residence in Canberra. And I think you asked the question, you said to her, what are your ambitions for the rest of your time as ambassador to Australia? What do you want to achieve? And she said, I want to go in the shitbox rally. That's my story.
Yeah, and she wanted to have sheep in the, yeah.
And she did go in the
yeah. We might just have to take one more, I think. This lady here.
Thank you. What realistically would the consequence of the Supreme Court finding that the executive is in contempt of its ruling?
Basically, can Trump override the Supreme Court in any way?
The polls are so overwhelming that my expectation would not be that Trump defies them. But there's obfuscation, Well, I'm going to take care of that. Well, I was never thinking of doing that. Well, we'll look into it. I have teenage kids. It's going to be avoiding a direct conflict because that will end badly for him politically. But, finding ways to wiggle and get around. So it's not constitutional crisis, but it's not a well-oiled constitutional machinery either.